Great. Thanks everyone for joining today. Welcome to our webinar, How to Measure Outcomes in Apricot Software. This is going to be a case study on Plummer Youth Promise, an Apricot user in Massachusetts. We appreciate your interest in today's topic and thank you for joining us. My name is Jeff Hegwood. I'm an Apricot software consultant at Sidekick Solutions. Sidekick Solutions is an Apricot certified implementation partner and consulting firm, and we specialize in social solutions Apricot software. We help new and existing users integrate Apricot with the way they work. And I'm fortunate today to be joined by Sarah Morrill. Sarah is the Director of Outcomes and Evaluation at Plummer Youth Promise. Sarah is a licensed social worker with 25 years in human service-related data analytics, outcomes measurement, and program design. Sarah joined the Plummer team after working as a consultant for Plummer leadership on the Plummer intervention and outcome model, and that is going to be the focus of today's webinar. We put together the webinar today to answer a single question. How do we design a program and outcomes model and then set up a data system that enables that model? Sarah and I both thought long and hard about this question, and we're excited to share today's presentation because Plummer's recent program growth and adoption of Apricot is going to highlight how we went from initial implementation towards answering this question. So our presentation today is going to cover three parts. The first is designing the program and outcomes model. The second is assessing the gaps in their initial data system design. And the third is how we redesign their system for integration with the outcomes model. Today's presentation is going to be a mix of strategy and technical, and we're going to cover a lot of ground. We do have 90 minutes set aside, and we're hoping to answer questions at the end as well. So at this point, let's go ahead and dive in. And to start, I'm going to hand it off to Sarah, who's going to give us some background on Plummer Youth Promise and explore the Plummer intervention and outcome model. Go ahead, Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So Plummer started as a, quote, farm school of reform for boys, and it was started from a bequest back in 1854 from a local philanthropist whose name was Caroline Plummer. So that's where the Plummer comes from. Originally envisioned as a juvenile diversion program, we also were an orphanage. We had many iterations of serving youth under how child welfare changed over the years. And we, at one point, were serving dozens of children in one building. That Victorian down in the left corner there is our original building. We are still in it today. By about 2005, so 150 years after our founding, we were then called Plummer Home for Boys. And we were down to about 10 teenage boys at a time, and all of them were referred through child welfare. So we weren't doing juvenile justice work anymore. We were really doing foster care kind of work. And so while we were considered to be a successful program, in terms of we always got referrals and our beds were always filled, the leadership, staff, and board felt that we really could be doing a lot more to support youth, and we really wanted to do better. We knew that when kids left here, they weren't always leaving to family. So we began a period of deep reflection, and we culminated with a new vision, a new mission, and we dedicated to measuring a theory of change. So we added that, that real dedication to outcomes. And along with that came a corresponding intervention and outcome model. And through this model, we wanted to answer these key questions. So we really wanted to get more information about how well we did, how satisfied people were, what kinds of activities it took to do the kind of work we were doing, if we were having an impact over the long term, if we were being true to what we said we would do, and how we compared with others. And today, we now serve both girls and boys, and from infants to young adults in residential, foster care, and community-based programs. And our name, Plummer Youth Promise, now reflects this theory of change and our promise of family for everyone. So the notion of family is incredibly important to us, and permanency specifically. So I'm going to just spend a second here to talk about how we define permanency. We use this best practice definition, which is one that ensures that all the youth that we serve leave here, or at least have the potential for enduring family relationships that is safe and lifelong, that offers the legal rights and the social status of full family membership, provides for physical, emotional, social, cognitive, spiritual well-being, and assures lifelong connections to birth and extended family, siblings, other adults, tapping into family history, traditions, race, ethnicity, culture. All of those pieces are incredibly important for the young people we serve. They're important for all of us, so they should be the same for those that we serve. So based on this, really, our definition of family does not only mean biological family. And this is a really important distinction for our model because, as I said, we're really committed to learning and measuring, so we have to be able to measure this as well. So while our journey has been long, in this webinar today, we really want to focus on the more recent history, specifically the development of our intervention and outcome model and the alignment of technology with our clinical practice. You're going to hear me talk a lot about intervention and outcome model. When I say intervention, I'm referring to the clinical activities that we provide within our program. So our intervention and outcome model came first, and we were able to depict visually a representation of our theory of change. We believed then, 2005, and then again in 2010, and even more so now based on our experience, that a strong model should precede the data system for tracking that model. However, we were very committed that we were going to measure that model. So knowing at the outset that the design process should include both sort of that clinical piece, how you're going to do, what you're going to do, what the outcomes are going to be. It's also thinking about how we can design something that's going to be measurable. So we started the design of our model the way most organizations do. We started with our own experience. And based on our experience, we knew that families were the key to long-term success for at-risk youth. So for example, in our residential program, oftentimes when young people would elope from the program, they would be going back to family, regardless of whether or not that family was approved for them to be visiting with. So we knew that families were really, really key. And other than that kind of data of elopement, we didn't have a lot of information to support our anecdote. And honestly, we weren't paid to make these connections happen. In some cases, we were kind of discouraged from having kids visit with family. We were really being paid to teach skills, to help prepare kids for school and work and how to save money, get their license, that kind of thing. So we wanted to test our theory of change against the day-to-day practices that were followed by our caseworkers and knew we needed an intentional and purposeful model. So we applied kind of a twofold approach to designing our model. First, the research. We learned as much as we could about the existing outcomes for the kind of young people that we served. So we sourced information both in the field of child welfare, as well as conducting a really deep dive into whatever data sets we did have from young people who had discharged from our program. So we looked at 3 years worth of discharge data, and this was all on paper. And we kind of parsed through both those external studies of what child welfare was teaching us, and then the internal data, and got a much more complete view of our work and where we sat along the continuum of services in child welfare. And this did take some time, and of course it took some dedicated resources. We were fortunate that we had some very strong volunteers, particularly on our board at that time, and we had an executive director who was really committed to having this work happen. All of that information, all those insights were brought back to staff for review and discussion. So we had periodic check-ins planned along the way to say, here's what we're learning, here's what we're finding, here's what we learned about kids who are here, does this sound right, what resonates? And then secondly, we talked to every staff member every board member, every key stakeholder that we could think of, including young people and their families, to learn more about what it was that they understood was happening with us, and what we were good at, what we struggled with, that kind of thing. So again, this was very time consuming. But the questions that we asked were pretty consistent across the groups. I think those are on the next slide. So these questions, again, we asked of every single group, and we wanted people to comment on the current assumptions of the program, what they thought was possible for the individuals we served, what we could improve on. And while the feedback from the external sources offered insight into what was happening kind of outside of the organization and our perception outside, the internal stakeholders identified where our team and our internal culture deviated from where we really planned to go and wanted to go. So again, it just demanded participation from all levels within the organization, and a lot of checking in. And we found that, you know, exploring these assumptions and sort of getting to the truth is not always really easy, but it was very, very necessary. And those last three questions, the ones, what does success look like for program participants, the activities, practices, interventions that drive success, and how we know success when we see it, those were really critical and really help set the stage for the next steps, because those become part of the design process. So following these two steps, we created our own template of what we thought it would take to get the results that we believed all young people deserve. And here they are. It's to have permanency through a safe, emotionally secure, stable parenting relationship, preferably in a lifelong legal family, but anybody who serves in the child welfare system, particularly older youth, we know that that's not always possible, so we wanted to be able to factor that in as well. We want our young people to be prepared with the skills and support necessary to meet their physical, emotional, educational, economic needs. So that's sort of that skill teaching stuff I talked about before, and to be connected to his, her, their community, having a safe place to live, a sense of belonging, a chance to positively contribute to their community. So we're not just talking about the community of maybe where they live while they're with us, but their community of choice, and their maybe could be connected back to the community where they originally came from. So the global goals of permanency, preparedness, and community, here's our visual theory of change here. Those became our outcome areas. And we knew that within each of those outcome areas, there were very specific, what we call life domain areas, that is where we can now track those essential indicators for youth progress within the global outcome areas. So the visualization of this model illustrates all the different domains, but as you can see from that light blue line kind of holding it all together, it's the same color as the permanency domains. This really emphasized for us that permanency is linchpin, that it's about family. And the design of this model evolved as we learned more and more about the importance of permanency. So as I said, we were working on those dual tracks of doing external research and internal discovery. And the external research kept leading us more and more and more down the path and being convinced that permanency is critically important. And so over the course of this work, we actually rebranded to Plummer Youth Promise, and our tagline shows just our commitment to permanency, family for everyone. We also now have a permanency practice leadership division, and we are asked to do consulting work and training for others in child welfare, specifically in the permanency practice area. So if designing the program model is a start, how do you actually get started? I think there are 4 takeaways from our process. The first one is really thinking about prioritizing the external research and that internal discovery. So I've said that a couple of times now. And the research and discovery starts with a critical question. What do we know about the problem we're trying to solve? So if we're trying to solve the problem of young people exiting care without a strong future, then we need to do as much research as we can about that problem. So we did extensive field research, and it helped us crystallize some of the concepts. It provided grounding in our direction. Again, family. We really need family. Then what does best practice in the field tell us? So we really do value the results-based work and evidence-based work done by others, and we really try to incorporate these lessons whenever it feels like a good fit, and we've been able to do that in a couple of instances. We also conducted that internal discovery, and it was both qualitative and quantitative. So combing through the data we did have, as scattered as it was, we also engaged frontline staff in very active conversations to determine what we did and what we didn't know about clients and programs. So even just sitting down and asking, what do you do? Why do you do it? How do you do it? What do you hope is going to happen when you do that? That can be a really rich discovery process. What do we know about what we already do, or about what we aren't doing? So understanding what best practice is telling us and how it may or may not intersect with what we're actually doing also provides that foundational information for designing a program and outcomes model. So step 2, this grid kind of talks about the very essential strong support that is required. The amount of organizational inertia required to get an initiative like this off the ground really cannot be understated. The process of designing a program model touches every single thing we do. It's the core of the DNA of our organization. And that sort of long-standing way of doing things can be very difficult to unwind and even more difficult to build back up. So if you have a purposeful process where you're including everybody, and it's got to start with leadership buy-in and stakeholder engagement, you can really make things happen. So being as inclusive as possible, especially with those who are on the front line doing the work every single day, is critically important. And then you also have to either have that ecosystem of tools and supports, either have them in place or have them promised. So one of the key things as we went through this process was to hold people harmless for a really long period of time. We're going to be talking about documentation here. If you don't have computers, you can't require people to be documenting in a systemic way. So we took a lot of time to build what we needed in order to support the model. The third thing is really, so while our model was informed by evidence-based practices, our measurement of it now is really performance-based. So merging those ideas of evidence-based and performance-based principles, we found to be very useful. And talking about performance-based, we're talking about the ability to collect and measure program outcomes and the indicators that lead to positive outcomes, and to demonstrate over time continuously improving outcomes through positive trends in performance. So while we have some of our own homegrown tools and processes to help measure what we do every day, they're not evidence-based, but we do believe they address our work and our model, and we're eager to test them. So in the here and now, we focus heavily on measuring performance, learning, refining the tools, refining the processes, and then measuring again. So we're in these constant cycles of learning. And whether our assumptions about our model are right or wrong, that, especially if we're talking about sort of using permanency and focusing on that, and that helps lead to a better outcome for kids, we do believe it's worth testing. So one of the goals we have for this year is to strengthen our performance-based work with the inclusion of some more outcome-specific evidence-based tools. So for example, I'm constantly on the lookout for those evidence-based assessments that could measure things like loneliness or sense of belonging or connection. And those I'd like to pair with our homegrown scaling tool that I think Jeff's going to talk about a little bit later. So we have found that having this performance-based focus can really help lead to more innovation. And so we kind of feel like we're on a bit of an entrepreneurial endeavor here with a goal to demonstrate our model, and we're building a lot of evidence, and we're using Apricot as our documentation tool to help us do that. So I would say whether formal evaluation is in your future plans or not, having a performance-based approach is something you can start right away, and you potentially layer in some evidence-based. We do have some evidence-based models that are part of our program design, and we are actually able to measure fidelity to those models within our Apricot system. So the fourth takeaway is designing a universal model and document it heavily. This goes right along with that performance-based measurement. So as much as possible, and you're going to hear it, we have this consistent theme around universal. So we designed our intervention and outcome model to be universal across all programs and services we offer. So permanency, preparedness, and community, regardless of the program you're in within our organization, and we've like 7 different programs, you're going to be there's going to be a focus in those areas for you. And so the service might vary a little bit, for example, by age or developmental stage. The approach, permanency, preparedness, community, with permanency as the linchpin, is universal. So in day-to-day practice, this means we needed to streamline our forms as much as possible. So to that end, we now have one universal intake and discharge, so that's sort of our enrollment form. We have a shared treatment planning and service coordination tool, and we have aligned that with the state required tool, so that it's some duplication of effort, but it's aligned with what they have to do for the state anyway. We have our own homegrown assessment tool. That's we call it our outcomes assessment, and it includes the 4-point scale to measure progress along a continuum within our 8 domain areas. And we also reimagined it was a daily progress note that is required, and we completely reimagined that. And in so doing, it is reflective of our intervention and outcome model, and it also engages all staff, all levels, all shifts to participate in documenting their interventions and the behaviors they observe of youth on a daily basis on the same form. So while the universal model really simplified our standard operating procedures and focused our team around a core set of principles, it did not decrease the need to document our processes. And in some ways, it kind of increased it because we were actually paying attention to it more now, and the information we are putting into the system is being used on a daily basis as opposed to just being documented for compliance purposes. We're using it for treatment as well. So we do heavily document all of our procedures, and it's been key to deploying the model across our programs for sure. So with our program model in place, it was time to implement the data system. And we selected Apricot, and it was prompted really by the need to have a product that was easy to use, would move us from paper to electronic records, and would not blow our budget. We were finding it really difficult to become more data informed without a data system. You know, everything was on paper. We had some Excel spreadsheets. Most of it was like on little card files, like all the discharge information was in somebody's Rolodex. So that really wasn't a healthy way to track how we were doing with those we serve. So the promise of Apricot was to manage data for compliance as well as clinical practice and outcomes. And since we were really well on our path for being committed to doing that, and had already been thinking about that in the design of our intervention and outcome model, it was kind of a given that we wanted Apricot to organize the data and report on outcomes, but we also wanted it to help reinforce our clinical practice because we were adopting these new ways of thinking, particularly around the permanency piece. So we wanted Apricot to help users kind of stay in the lane toward the methodology we had developed for supporting youth. So these were the principles we had going in. but we did not have any concrete examples on how this translated to Apricot or any data system for that matter. It was really difficult to see the full picture of what a data system should be. And given that we were transitioning from sort of paper forms and spreadsheets, especially, and given that somebody with zero IT background was going to be in charge of doing this, we had clear direction for the program, the model, but we were kind of learning as we went when it came to designing the data system. So from the very beginning, we were, again, ease of use was one of the key factors here. And we were able to build the forms, establish and employ the dynamic links to improve our reporting and generate sort of basic census, demographic, and trend reporting, and sort of like beginning outcome kind of reporting because of the dynamic links. We kind of quickly moved through Apricot 101, making sure to leverage all the basics and the standards that Apricot offered right out of the box. But as we began refining our model and we continued to grow the organization, because we did grow from a single site residential program to foster care to community-based and some additional programs. So as we were growing, it really began to stretch the limits of how we had originally configured Apricot. So we were evolving way past the 101 basics quickly, and we were ready to graduate to the 201 or even higher. So with the new programs being added, and some of them focused more on one of the three outcome areas. So we have one program in particular that is providing just the permanency services to individuals living in other residential providers. So that's one kind of clear example. We've also had new funders who are seeking much more specific data sets, which is a good thing. But Apricot started to feel like a constraining technology instead of an enabling one. It just wasn't configured properly for our growth, and it was becoming more of a challenge than a helpful tool. And so some of those challenges we had included, we were finding it really difficult to track multiple enrollments. So if a youth was enrolled either in consecutive programs or re-enrolled after a gap following a discharge, so that happens kind of more often for us, that we have individuals who might be in one program, leave and come back, or move from one of our programs to another of our programs. So we were having a hard time tracking that type of movement. We would also lose some of the historical data when a young person would change status in a program. And because we were tracking status as of today without being able to maintain that historical context of each change. We had a hard time correlating intake, those ratings on that scale I mentioned, the different kinds of activities recorded on progress notes, and discharge data without heavily relying on external reporting systems or manual ways. So I'd have to export a whole lot of stuff to Excel and do a lot of manipulation in order to count things across the life of a case, especially if that case or that individual moved across programs. We were also noticing that our forms were getting larger and larger, and staff were becoming really overwhelmed by the data entry tasks required of them. We were trying not to make too many changes too quickly, but as we adapted to increased programs and different requirements of the state, we kind of had to make some changes, and that was overwhelming. So we tried to uncover some of the causes. So we actually kind of developed a priority list of things that we hoped to resolve in Apricot. We made various attempts to actually draw out physically the architecture of our system, sort of which forms linked to which forms, what the logic was on the forms. And this was all in an effort to better identify what we're missing, but we really needed a fresh set of eyes, and ended up contracting with Sidekick for this kind of support. Right off the bat, Jeff helped us identify the potential gap in our system, which was really that sort of linchpin in what could turn this from a lackluster system to a high performance system. And that was that we needed a program enrollment record. So the enrollment record was really the key to that universal design that allowed the data to be segmented by program. And as we worked through our priority list, that enrollment issue just kept getting bigger and bigger. We realized that that really was the issue that we needed to solve for. But redesigning our Apricot to fix that problem, while it was always an option, we did hesitate multiple times because redesigning the system meant not only the potential cost, but would we have to migrate all our existing data that we had already collected, and would we have to retrain staff on sort of a new set of forms? So there were a lot of different factors to consider there. So too much budget and too many unknowns to make a smart decision. We decided to take a step back and look at the system holistically, but with a process that really had to respect our budget constraints. So when Jeff suggested that he do an Apricot database specification and discovery, or spec, as a spec project as we call it, we decided that we would put a pause on our priorities and really follow Jeff's lead to complete that spec project. So I'm going to let Jeff talk about that process.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So a spec project sounds kind of buzzy. It sounds like a buzzy word, but there's a reason why we need to take a step back and take a look at Apricot from the big picture. Apricot is an application builder. It's got a set of rules and constraints on how you can build it, and it allows flexibility to create custom data entry and workflow and reporting systems for nearly any program, service, or outcome model. And because every Apricot build is unique, even when they're similar, those slight variations really need to be mapped out so we can understand the implications of any one Apricot design. So we go through a process called a spec to assess Apricot, and what that does is it lays out all the pieces on the floor. So when you log into Apricot, you can see all your forms, you can see some of the features in your system. The spec process actually maps that out. We develop a mapping tool called an ERD, or an entity relationship diagram, and that's shown here on the right. And that maps out Apricot from end to end. Now, a finished ERD looks a bit like a subway map, and it can be a little overwhelming to look at when you look at the whole thing in total. But what this helps us do is look at the form and linking relationships between the objects and tables in your Apricot. So why is this important? As we say, forms and links are the whole ball game in your Apricot database. They determine how you can report on your data. Specifically, what kinds of reporting is even possible or not possible. It's going to determine how those reports are configured, but most importantly, it's going to determine how efficient it is to build a report with your data. Now, ultimately, when we put all these things together, we're trying to answer the question, which is the intent of an Apricot platform: can we report on outcomes? The right data model in Apricot expands its potential for reporting on outcomes. You can also develop dashboard analytics and enhance user workflow. So again, forms and links in Apricot are really the whole ballgame. So when we mapped out Plummer's system, we found that there were 4 major takeaways. Unfortunately, the system just wouldn't scale long term because each program had its own set of forms and its own set of reports. So every time a new program was added to Plummer's mix in Apricot, there'd be a new intake form, a new progress note form, new assessment forms, and new reports to govern each program. In total, these programs were working in silos. So the reporting that Sarah wanted to do about continuity of service, how youth transition from program to program, or seeing the big picture of the organization, a attributed to the model across all programs, it just wasn't possible without some very heavy lifting in terms of manual manipulation outside of Apricot. A lot of this was governed by this idea that we didn't have a universal program enrollment form, and we didn't have a single discharge form shared by all programs. So, as I mentioned, for youth that crossed programs, we really had no way to report on them without mashing the data together externally. The other limitation that we found is that we had no workflow systems to govern treatment planning and assessment processes. Plummer was able to track goals, but the system didn't alert users when the next interval was due. Users had to remember what to do next. Apricot was a data entry portal, and in order for users to remember which interval they were on, they'd have to go digging through the system, and that's not ideal. That created some data quality concerns. In addition, when we ran an inventory of Plummer's top 20 to 30 reports, most of those reports governed by the intervention and outcome model, we found that the majority of them had to be exported to Excel. We could rely very little on Apricot's standard reporting tools to develop reports, which means that Sarah had to spend a lot of her time manipulating the data in external systems. So once we developed an ERD of the current system, we transitioned into developing an ERD or a blueprint of the vision system. The vision ERD is what an ideal Apricot configuration would look like. So that required a deeper dive into Plummer's intervention and outcome model. And with Sarah's help, we also gathered user feedback from users on what was working and what wasn't working. With the two ERDs in hand, or the two blueprints, we concluded the spec by comparing the two blueprints and noting the differences. So generally what we find is that when we compare these two, there's one of two directions we can go. Either the differences between the two ERDs highlight a need to redesign the system from scratch, or we can make incremental changes toward that vision system. In Plummer's case, we identified a clear need to redesign, and it was unsurprising, but ultimately it centered around the concept of a program enrollment form. So now that the decision to proceed with the redesign was in play, that's where we had some back and forth with the Plummer team and Sarah to determine how we would take next steps. So Sarah, you want to talk about how that went?
Sure. Yeah. So that first investment for the spec was pretty easy, actually, and that's kind of the point, that having that roadmap really helped us to think about what we needed to do next. We needed a low-cost, low-risk project to get us started. But the investment for that redesign, that wasn't as easy. So we knew that investing in redesign could be a substantial investment. And if you remember, the price point was one of the driving factors when we started with Apricot, but we didn't really know where that redesign was going to land. And we really can't make light of that decision. It was kind of one of those oh shoot moments, because the investment was unexpected and not really budgeted and fairly significant, particularly in light of, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of work is not really what we're paid to do. We were finding private funding to help support our desire to measure outcomes. So having to go down this road, it did take us, it took a lot of thinking. But as we saw it, we really had two different options. We could stay with the current system, and even though we had gaps in our system, a couple of really key things were happening. First of all, staff morale was up, which is huge. People were more engaged in the work they were doing. They saw the longer term vision for what was, what we were hoping for kids and their role within it. They understood our mission and how they related to it. And the other thing, youth were more engaged with their goals. So not only did sort of the clinical folks here understand what the treatment goals were, everybody who worked with those young people understood their goals, and they could talk with them about their goals. Those big culture shifts were huge. And the system did track kind of the core of what we wanted. However, it was really inefficient. And it, as Jeff said, it really wasn't going to scale long term, especially as we kept adding programs. So if we stayed with our existing platform, we would sacrifice the scalability of the expanding our model. And for me personally, it was a decision of sort of whether I wanted to be managing a database or really analyzing data and facilitating the evaluation work, which is a lot more fun, no offense, Jeff. But for the organization, it was, you know, do we want to staff up around the database administration or keep resources focused within the programs, which is where the work is actually happening. So there was a cost to the inefficiencies that we faced with the current system, and we had to be honest about that cost. Secondly, while a redesign carried a significant cost that was neither expected or budgeted, it also provided us the opportunity of having really a world-class data system, at least we think so, and one that could grow with our programs, with our vision. It would be supporting staff in that sort of the nuance and the structure of our outcome model, and we would be much more capable of efficiently reporting on the questions we wanted to answer. And our evaluation questions have become a bit more sophisticated as we use data. So we knew that that was just going to continue, and it was really a pivot point for us. So fortunately, leadership did see the benefit of a one-time expense to redesign the system on the front end in order to free up time on database administration on the back end. So it would allow us to continue to develop outcomes management toward a more research and evaluation kind of path than just system administration. So while we're focused on reporting from an evaluative standpoint as opposed to an administrative standpoint. And so after having internal conversations and really, you know, struggling over this, we kind of did something a little unexpected, maybe especially in working with consultants. We just shared all of our project constraints with Jeff. So we talked about the budget, the timeline, the whole story, and understanding, particularly in, you know, these small nonprofit organizations, how challenging these decisions can be. And I'm really glad we did, because it helped open up a conversation to even some new options that we hadn't thought of before. And we kind of didn't think it was even possible, but putting it all on the table allowed us to come to this different place. And I'm going to let Jeff talk about that.
So there were two options to consider, and there's an important takeaway here. Actually, a couple of important takeaways about technology redesign projects, and they're worth noting. But the two options to consider as part of this redesign, there was one option was to redesign all programs at once and simultaneously migrate all of the historical data to the new format. Now, that was going to be a massive project and ended up being too expensive and honestly too intense on timeline to even consider. Now, in my opinion, that type of project is rarely a good fit and generally more aggressive than prudent. The second option, which is where we arrived in the end, was a staggered implementation approach that bought some time for Plummer to get closer to their fiscal year break. So the goal was that we'd implement 2 programs first and then continue with 2 additional programs in staggered timelines, all happening before the new fiscal year. Then there was the kicker. We wouldn't migrate a single record in Apricot. There'd be no data migration. Instead, we'd start fresh on the new fiscal year with a new system and archive everything historical in its current location. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Now, obviously, my recommendation was to do the second option, and for those reasons. And that's what actually allowed us to launch a 2.0 version of Plummer's Apricot at the fiscal year start. Now, of course, when we think about data migration, especially after, I think we had 3 or maybe more years, Sarah, does that sound about right, of historical data in the system at that point? It was a good chunk.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So obviously, Sarah had some questions, and I would expect those questions about the no data migration. So we were recommending an archive in place strategy. Um, and what that meant is that we would allow view only access to users to that historical data where it lived. Now, it's understandable to have concerns about no data migration because it sounds kind of like a halfway strategy when you're considering a redesign. Um, but with the assurances that we could set up permission sets to allow users that view only access, so it was referenceable to people, to the end users on the ground, and explaining that there would be some short-term pain with split reporting while we transitioned across this fiscal year break, we were ready to prepare for next steps at that point. So I think, Sarah, we found this flexibility to be helpful, and maybe you can talk a little bit about how you thought about data migration out of the gate.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, ideally, of course, we'd want everything, but it really was not going to be possible. So this alternative, this flexibility made it possible to move forward within our real life constraints of what was happening here. It did mean for a period of time, and we still have a few cases that still fit this mold, we have to pull from 2 data sets. So we have sort of the archive view only data set, and we have our existing data set. It's not ideal, but the short-term pain of a split data set for annual and aggregate reporting is significantly less than that potential cost to migrate all the data. So what is this, like 18 plus months into it, it worked and it is still working. So I would say there's no making light of that decision to invest in redesign. We had tons of meetings, there was a lot of back and forth, but we really had to be honest about what we wanted long-term for our organization, being outcome focused. And that's how we made the priority to redesign the system. And so there are kind of 3 specific takeaways here.
Yeah, so the first one is we want to define what's what. So it's best to get a clear picture of what's what in order to make informed decisions about next steps. And even I can be a bit skeptical about assessments. When we think about assessments of a data system or any type of platform, we don't want those assessment outcomes to sit on a shelf. We want to make sure that they're acted upon, and we don't want to waste resources on assessments that can't be actionable. So one way to think about assessments is to break it down into 3 simple steps. We're going to define the current state or the status quo. We're going to define the vision or the future opportunity, and we're going to compare the 2 and develop a roadmap. The big outcome from an assessment is if the comparison of the status quo current situation and the future vision validates your challenges, so what you're experiencing now, and identifies opportunities for resolving those challenges, then the assessment's done its job. And learning what's what is a low-cost first step that can ground decision making and lay all the pieces out on the table. So the second takeaway about when thinking about redesign or thinking about modifying a piece of your Apricot is to run a complete comparison of value. And I think Sarah and the Plummer team did a really great job at thinking through this and really took their time in doing it. So all investments are an equation or an evaluation of value. There's a cost to redesign, but there's also a cost not to redesign. And there's benefits on both sides of that equation. So building the case is essential. Generally speaking, our experience is that when we're building the case for software, either new software or redesigning it, we're looking at the costs and benefits in 4 domains. things like the efficiency of time or the inefficiency of time, pure dollar costs, the accuracy of decision making, like having better information available to you, and increase or decrease in emotional energy, like stress or focus. So I do have a link here at the bottom of this slide. If you want to think more about the business case associated with these types of decisions, we do have some more information on our website about that. The third takeaway is a big one. Total data migration isn't the only option. So when considering a redesign or a transition to new features, the most common response that we receive on data migration is, we want the whole thing. We want all of our data to move to the new system. But with some exploration, we can learn that total data migration might not be needed. First thing, consider a transition on a calendar year or fiscal year break. If you're willing to cope with some split reporting for a short-term period, maybe 1 to 2 years, and we're finding that as we get farther and farther away from the break with Plummer Youth Promise, that our data set is getting more and more contiguous, getting tighter around the new model, with less reliance on that split period. And that's just based on kids enrolling, discharging from that old model. So doing that lowers the cost of redesign as well as the timeline for redesign. Generally speaking, we advise most of our clients to be realistic with data migration. There's some things that you can think about in that process. You can think about, what data do you actually use? How do you use it? And you can consider alternatives like partial data migrations or even the archive in place strategy that Plummer used. The good news about an archive in place strategy, like in Plummer's case, is that if we ever decided that we absolutely needed the data set, it's right there for us to get. And we could always complete a data migration later. By doing that, it took back the urgency of data migration so we could make a smarter decision in the future and see if we actually needed the data. And again, like Sarah said, 18 months later, we found that we're doing okay. So once the decision to re-implement and redesign was in place, we got kicked off. And Sarah made a very clear statement about what she wanted in the new design. And a lot of that was built off of her prior experiences in the 1.0 design. She stated that she wanted to facilitate the analytics that we needed for the outcomes model, but equally important was configuring the system to reinforce the clinical practice. And that's something that I found really unique. She wanted a technology that would enable the day-to-day work of engaging with youth, engaging with clients. So we got started. Like so many other parts of this journey, this took time. Sarah and I met weekly. Although the spec identified the general architecture for the Vision Apricot, we needed to continue to refine the assumptions. And we actually didn't get the design right until the 4th iteration. While we can't cover the entire system or every step we went through to get there today, I do want to highlight some components of their Apricot because they might be relevant to your own Apricot design. Quick disclaimer, we are going to show screenshots in this presentation. We're not going to show the live site just to protect client information in Plummer's live system. So bear with us here. So the first thing we've talked about this is universal system design. So this was a key assumption going in and became the foundation for saving time in Apricot database administration. It also saved us time in reporting, and it also saved us time in some future program implementations that came after this initial redesign. So the core design now is going to support cross-program data tracking with the ability to use program filters in reports. So we currently operate 6 programs across residential, independent living, and foster care. And that includes a shared referral form for incoming referrals and program eligibility reporting, a shared face sheet with standardized demographics for all programs, a shared intake and discharge form, which we call the enrollment, so we can report on the totality of participation in Plummer's programs. And then a really neat model, which we're going to dive into it with a little bit more detail, is a shared treatment plan, shared progress notes, and shared outcomes assessment. So all programs are operating from the same intervention and outcomes model. Now, the most technical component of the universal design was the intake and discharge, which again, we called the program enrollment form. So we've touched on this a couple of times, but let's talk about the actual design. So in total, the new design has a single enrollment form to track all program intake and exit, and the ability to track and report on multiple, simultaneous, and repeat enrollments. This helps us get at continuity of service, helps us report globally across all programs, and it helps us maintain operational consistency. Now, to start, Sarah and I worked closely to parse the data requirements for each program to find shared and common fields. We called this a crosswalk, and it was a big task. Sarah and I had a pretty big blueprint going of all the fields across all of the different programs and trying to relate them into one shared enrollment form. But the neat thing was that because the theory of change and the intervention outcome model was in place, Sarah was able to help identify where we could consolidate around the three outcomes areas of permanency, preparedness, and community. We achieved the goal. We were able to get a single enrollment, but there were still some fields that could not be crosswalked and were unique to each program. And this primarily came up in our foster care side. Those requirements, those fields were compliance related, so we couldn't just overlook them or leave them off. However, with the crosswalk, our intake form, our enrollment form was getting too big, and there was just too much conditional logic on the form. We needed another way to capture program-specific intake data. So we opted an enrollment supplement approach. So what we did in Apricot is we hard-coded the data system to allow one and only one supplement per enrollment based on the program that was selected. So for example, if you selected foster care, you were able to create one and only one foster care supplement that carried the foster care enrollment details. So this gave us the best of both worlds. We had a universal design in the program enrollment form that honored programs, that had a common and shared set of fields. But then we also honored program specificity with the supplement record. When we paired this with data quality reporting, we knew which intakes should have a supplement, but none existed, and were able to prompt users to complete them. So this structure has come into play quite a bit, and we actually have two supplements for two separate programs. The integration of the Plummer workflow with Apricot was the breakthrough of the design, and that's what took us 4 iterations to get. So each program, based on compliance, has different intervals that are used to trigger treatment planning events and reviews. So you can think of this like a 30-day review, 90-day review, 90 days, so on and so on. Because Plummer has so many programs, some of those intervals are different. So you might have one that starts with 30 days, 90, 90, 90, or another program that does one at intake, 90, 90, 90, various intervals. And that was the hardest part of the design because we needed the ability to keep universal structure while aligning those different intervals in that existing structure. So we came up with this workflow diagram shown here, and it identifies the steps required at each program interval. Then we used program-specific logic to identify the intervals that are available for that program, which we'll show in a bit, and that's what enforced the day-to-day workflow. So this workflow, you're probably familiar with this type of model. It's a case management practice with a recurring interval for treatment planning, goal setting, and assessment, followed by regular evaluations of progress towards the treatment plan goals. So we'd start at the beginning, create a treatment plan, complete an assessment for baseline. We'd review progress and update on the treatment plan, create a new treatment plan, do an assessment for a new kind of a pre-post, and then continue those intervals ongoing. So the workflow identified the form structure, but it also presented us with an opportunity, and we didn't fully expect the total opportunity that we were going to get by getting this model right in a universal context. So using the workflow model, we started to ask the question, well, can we notify staff what to do next? And that's where the active status dashboard was born. And the active status dashboard tracks caseload, the progress review and updates to do, treatment plans to do, and assessments to do. The neat thing is that the active status dashboard is conditional, which means that a task remains in a user's queue until it's complete. There's no workarounds. And Sarah and I have talked a lot about the rigidity of this, which helps with data quality. The active status dashboard provides a clear action list for the entire Plummer team. So here's some screenshots of what the active status dashboard looks like and highlighting just a few of its core components. So first, we have a simple caseload report, and it's grouped by program. We have another section of similar design that groups by staff. And you can see that using the Apricot 360 license, we're able to create shortcuts from this dashboard to immediately edit the universal face sheet or go to this individual's document folder. The second highlights the progress review and updates to do, showing when a task is due, how long it's been overdue, and then provides a quick link to complete the step. So if you click that record, it'll actually go to the treatment plan so you can complete your progress review and update. This report is grouped by staff, which means that staff can see which tasks are on their to-do list. The third is for treatment plans to do, and that shows when the task is due and only triggers when a progress review and update for the previous interval is complete. So we don't create a treatment plan until the progress review and update on the prior is done. And so this dashboard facilitates that, where they have to complete the progress review and update for the prior interval before they create the next treatment plan. So if we go back to the workflow, that reinforces this workflow chain ongoing. And then the last one is identifying outcomes assessments to do. And that shows when a task is due, sorted in priority order by most overdue. And then we have quick links again here, where if you click these links, it'll create a new assessment. So we don't have to go to the document folder and click around. We can actually just create it right from this dashboard. So I think it's one click instead of 4. So we're helping users get to the task quicker by allowing these quick links in the dashboard. So in addition to the active status dashboard, we also built assessment to-do lists and conditional data quality reports, and those are helping Plummer adhere to compliance standards and funding requirements, and also clinical treatment planning. The neat thing about how we've designed these data quality reports is that each of them are conditional. So a lot like the active status dashboard, where if you complete a task, it will fall out of the queue. The data quality reports do the same thing. they highlight gaps in data quality, and when they're complete, they fall out of the queue. So we use a principle, Sarah and I do, that if the data quality report is blank, we know that for all the checks that we have, our data quality is perfect. And that allows Plummer to do real-time data quality instead of just monthly audits. So another feature in Plummer's Apricot design is correlated data set. So Plummer tracks and reports on the following indicators to create a complete picture of a youth's progress. And it's a pretty substantial list of indicators. So we're tracking presenting behaviors on progress notes, services delivered, milestones achieved, domain area ratings, so that's our outcomes assessment, and then goal status changes at each treatment plan interval. Now that's a dense list of indicators, and our challenge in the redesign was getting a handle on how we could correlate those indicators to try and tease out how we are making progress and how we're helping youth achieve. So in that process, the correlation at interval was key. At the time of design, and Sarah, I don't know if this has changed since then. I think it's evolving. We had a 10-month concept. We felt like we would see change at 10 months. That sound? That was
yes.
I think that was how we had it.
Honestly, because of the data we are now able to analyze, we're going to be able to put that question back on the table. Was that assumption correct?
Love that. That's great. So because 10 months or because any interval, we wanted to know how much time or where change occurred at interval. We needed the ability to correlate these indicators at interval, 30, 90, 180, and so on. And that was key for our aggregate reporting. We needed a way to mash that up and really start to analyze where youth made significant progress and at which interval. So how we put this all together is that every one of these indicators is evaluated at a particular interval, and the data quality reporting supports us in identifying or ensuring that intervals are done in consecutive order. So we're able to track behaviors, services, and milestones. That's number one. Those are part of the progress note, and we needed a way to identify multiple items per progress note. So we actually used a dynamic checkbox, a many-to-many relationship that allows us to count the number of times an event, a milestone, a behavior, or service happens, along with its relationship to the particular interval. So you can imagine reporting that totals up by interval how many times each one of these things happens. Number two is we have domain area ratings that measure progress in each of the domains. There are 8 of them. And we are using those to correlate against the intensity of service or dosage or instances of milestones, behaviors, and services. The matrix rating, the domain area ratings, also help us chart progress over time so that users can see trends. We used a pre-post structure in order to get multiples so we can track one assessment per interval. The third piece is the goal status, and that was the final piece of the puzzle. As we discussed earlier, the workflow of treatment planning meant that we would complete a progress review and update at the conclusion of each interval before we started a new treatment plan. And that opened up an opportunity for us to revisit goals that had been assigned at the start of a treatment plan interval at the end. And we could determine if the goal was complete, incomplete, needed attention, or should be reevaluated. So the correlated data set is the aggregate of all of these components by interval. Sarah wants to know when, how long, and based on what factors participants turn corners in progress, and the structure was designed to support that. So to analyze these correlations, we developed an aggregate, we call it the parser, an aggregate parser that leverages Apricot standard reporting. And the parse data supports the evaluation of progress at interval. That's the top one. So you can see 90 to 120 ratings against 270 to 300 ratings. The correlation of dosage, intensity of service on behaviors, milestones, interventions, and services. Call that kind of concentration. So the concentration of those events over time. And then we can also track goal achievement per domain. And to be honest, we've only begun to scratch the surface. So Plummer recently upgraded to Apricot 360 a little less than 30 days ago. So we're actually working on transitioning the parsing report into Apricot Insights so we can get at this data quicker. It's important to note that we're employing a gradual approach to reporting that reinforces an understanding of the data before we proceed to more report development. So this model or this approach that we've taken has allowed us to steadily increase capacity in the data model over time, but we're far from finished. As Sarah indicated, we're starting to bring questions or hypotheses that we had at the start back to the table to evaluate whether or not they're true. That's informing new reports and new questions, and that cycle continues to go. So as part of the redesign, we identified that some resources were tracked to youth as a global measure rather than program specific. So although we designed the system universally to be programs filterable, there were some components that are global to a youth. They don't have program specificity. They cross programs. And while we don't have time to cover the full scope of this concept during the webinar and all the forms that we assigned as global, we did want to highlight the team form because of its application to the permanency practice. So the team form does not have a relationship to an enrollment. The team form identifies relationships that a youth has with other individuals and keeps a log of people that touch a youth's life. What's interesting about the design of the team form is that we actually profile an individual without creating a tier 1 profile for them in Apricot. That means we allow these team members to live globally in a youth's document folder because we recognize that a youth's relationships aren't program specific. So generally, profiles are tier 1 forms in Apricot, generally, not tier 2 forms. But in this case, we're able to create a supplemental form that allows us to count the number of team members, track the growth of team members over time, and identify what relationships are most important to a youth. And we found that to be very essential. So I have to credit Plummer for their continued investment in Apricot, especially as an enabling technology, because even as the redesign project was wrapping up, we had identified some nice to have features that ended up becoming a part of our design work. One of those nice to have functions was what we call data visibility. So we were thinking about data visibility as the capability to surface data that is relevant in time, like a particular event or an interval, or the ability to pull up information on demand. And we needed to get that into the hands of leadership, end users, other users in the Apricot system, Sarah specifically. And so this redesign, while prompted as this concept of having a world-class data system, Plummer stuck with that principle, and we started to develop some reports. The first was the Youth Summary Report. The Youth Summary Reports have become a fan favorite at Plummer, so much so that it holds the acronym of the YSR. And users have demanded more data in the YSR that it is now 6 parts. It is a 6-part report. So the report searches for a single youth and then creates a profile for each youth based on their participation in all Plummer programming. The YSR has summaries, treatment planning information. It has different parts for each outcome area. And we also chart out progress and make relationship between pre-post scores, progress at interval. Some examples are here on the right, so that users can start to see where youth are making progress or aren't and make adjustments to their treatment planning. So this report is actually run frequently and is also used at treatment planning intervals. So the next piece is that we developed a batch of leadership team reports, and Sarah's appetite for this leadership team report has turned it into 13 separate reports. We have the ability to report on youth that are active as of today, discharged youth based on a particular range, referral volume, and then also youth that participated in a range, something like a cohort analysis. Each leadership team report has a number of indicators. So an example is set up here of our active youth. What's the most recent F&P rating on their most current outcomes assessment? And this tells us where our population is at any one time. Sarah puts those all together, and those become discussion points at leadership team meetings. And it's become an essential part of the leadership group. 2 other reports that we've developed, one is printable templates. Plummer was running a number of processes via a word merge and then manual aggregation, like typing Apricot data into a Word document. And for anyone who runs active census reports, face sheets, case files, it's easy to think of Apricot as purely a data system, but we can actually begin to format printable templates that can be used to build a case file, that can be used to cover some of these physical copies that we need to keep for either compliance or helpful to take to sessions with a client. In Plummer's case, the active census as of today was a perfect example of a printable report where we could simply grab a program name and print out all of the youth, all of the face sheets for all of the youth that are active in any particular program. So one of our more recent developments in terms of reporting has been for case reviews and accreditation. This is a pretty dense feature set, so we're not going to go into too much depth today, but we do want to highlight a couple of things because Apricot is actually enabling accreditation. And that in some cases can feel surprising, but it's also exciting because it saves a lot of time. We have a report that supports randomized case sampling at each interval, and that tells us through a process, we run a process with a guide that tells us which cases we're going to sample in any given quarterly review. We also have a form shown here on the right that's used to track case reviews per youth. We actually log these in Apricot, and then we can report on them. Long term, we're going to use the report of these case reviews to start to inform process improvement and continuous process improvement. So we've completed over 20 reviews since getting started late last year. And so far, we're finding real success in that Apricot task, and it's saving a lot of time based on how we've configured it. As you all know, case reviews can take a considerable amount of time. So Sarah's going to wrap up with some summary information about our wins and where we stand today. Go ahead, Sarah.
Great. So as of today, we have 49 active users, and we have expectations that we're going to continue to grow and add users. We have 6 programs that are operating on the shared universal system. We have 1 additional program that allows 20 subcontractors with partial guest access to track permanency-specific interventions related to a court mediation program. So it sits slightly outside, but it touches the permanency practice. 100% of our staff in the 6 programs are all trained on Apricot, and they're documenting toward outcomes on a regular basis. And we now have all these great kind of utilization and compliance mechanisms built in here so we can check that. 100% of our staff on all shifts are aware of and engaged in client goals. So this is a huge shift from where we were all those years ago. And while those numbers are important, the other advances that are, excuse me, really worth noting, case notes are reflective of clinical interventions and behavioral changes all the time. So we're no longer getting sort of in good space or ran, eloped from program. We're getting very detailed information on a daily basis on all the young people that we serve. As Jeff mentioned, we also have those data quality and management reports that are helping us not only, track how we're doing with data entry, but the quality of that data entry and how it's being used to inform treatment. So we are now actively using data not only for compliance purposes, but also for treatment planning, for outcome tracking, and also now our accreditation. So we are in the process of getting accredited, and so this is the data system plays a huge role in that. So having been part of this process from the very beginning, originally as a board member, I've witnessed a huge shift in culture, as I've mentioned, both in the clinical competency as well as in respect for data. So what started as kind of the eye rolling has turned into very positive feedback. Jeff mentioned those youth summary reports. Staff are coming and saying, look, I'm at a foster care review. I need to be able to look at the last date of their medical appointment. They can pull that up now within seconds. So it's very, very helpful. So while we've talked a lot about the wins during this webinar, and it sort of implies that Apricot and our model and everything's all figured out, it really, as Jeff said, has not been a straight, unencumbered path. We have had lots of fits and starts. And while we're sort of looking at the positives, we are also really far from being complete. So while we have a great structure for data entry and being able to visualize the data, and it helps reinforce our model and staff adherence to that model, the staff are increasingly able to see the connection between what they're doing every day and the outcomes that kids are experiencing. We have a series of reports that are now filtered by program. So instead of having a bunch of different reports, they can go to a single source and filter it in a way that allows them to see what's happening either for that individual they're working with or as a program director for the entire program. So we're being able to move from that anecdote about why to really getting at what we think is the connection between treatment and outcomes. We have a lot more time to do the fun stuff. So instead of sort of complaining about having to do data entry, as I said, staff are beginning to ask real important evaluation questions, and we're being able to move in the direction of doing those kinds of studies. New programs that we may implement here are now much easier to overlay onto our existing structure, or as I mentioned in the court program case, we can connect them through the piece of the program model that is the same. So instead of implementing new forms, we're able to incrementally grow the data system with less effort. Our data quality procedures are much improved. So we have this ongoing list through the data quality reports of the cleanup tasks. And we've now, through our accreditation process, we've engaged our program directors to be part of that process of doing those regular checks. And we're using those checks to reinforce supervision. So the areas that we're really hoping that to improve upon, one of the things that does happen is occasionally the state or even a funder might change what they call something. So for example, one of the ones that seems to change with some consistency is how race or gender are categorized. So we need to make sure that when we make these changes, we understand how they're going to affect the existing data set. So we often have to do these little mini data migrations and make sure that the historical and the new data set are going to be comparable. Seamless intervention of new capabilities. So while we don't always have the resources, either the time or the ability to have consistent attention, to maintain constant attention to Apricot, so still a department of one, so I kind of come in and out of my interaction with Apricot, so it can create some disjointed implementation. So we continue to work on being patient in how we deploy things, and sometimes it feels like we're always kind of in this constant sprint, but we have to be able to have that flexibility to come in and out. So that's this ongoing challenge. We also need to make sure that we're finding better ways and more consistent ways to train staff and make sure that staff understand how to use Apricot from the very, very basics. The data quality report actually identified for us a couple of areas where we thought staff understood how to enter certain things, and they really didn't. So having that report allowed us to go back out and retrain. What we want to work on now is designing videotape training modules that we can put on our own private YouTube channel or on our shared drive. And those can go hand in hand with the user guides. So when we have new staff, we can train them and then give them this reference point to go back in and get refreshers. So also, our data policies and procedures were really not as inclusive in order to reinforce the system. So accreditation was very helpful with this regard. We now have data policies and procedures, and we're in the process of implementing those and tying the data quality reports to those, as well as now looking at how do we start thinking about supervision as part of that, so it really crosswalks into HR practices here. So we are in the process of rolling those out. So I've already started talking a little bit about those next steps. So now that we have the technology, people have access to computers, they're trained, we have the policies, we have the procedures in place, we're still sort of working on that kind of nagging issue of accountability. So we want to now focus on designing some supervisory tools that will also be housed in Apricot that will link the clinical practice to human resource expectations, as well as making sure that people understand how to apply our intervention and outcome model within cases. So we're really excited about that. That's in process. We, well, the report development and analytics, as Jeff mentioned, we've got many reports and many sections of reports. So it's not necessarily a weakness we need to address, but it's a constant topic for capacity building. So instead of having, 10 reports, how do we look at one report with multiple sections that can be filtered in a variety of ways so that we have one source to go to that's going to answer a bunch of different questions. So we're beginning to move some of our reports into the more advanced reporting tools on Apricot 360. So it's going to better allow us to coordinate youth indicators and look at those trends with our interventions, behaviors, and our milestones. So as I said, we're in the midst of applying for accreditation. So making sure that our Apricot workflow processes reflect our procedures. That's another thing that we are working toward. We're hoping to be able to at some point itemize the financial benefit of this intervention, this permanency practice. So looking at data from a larger perspective, not just what's in Apricot, but financial data, that's another goal we have. And we also want to be able to do these targeted evaluation studies, as I mentioned earlier, where we do use some evidence-based models, and we want to be able to look at how well we're doing those with fidelity to those models. We're also part of this peer organization network. There's a few other organizations who are also doing this very specific permanency practice. We are going to do a shared data study. So we've been working with Jeff to pull the data from the system in a particular format so that we can share it across organizations and learn more about the application of these permanency practices. So the goal for this webinar was really to show how we've approached tracking and reporting outcomes using the Apricot software. And our experience has really reinforced our belief that the design of the outcome model needs to come first, so the intervention and outcome model, and then the design of the data collection and documentation and reporting system. So it's kind of here in 10 steps. I would say that there's 3 different kind of buckets. Steps 1 through 4 really talk about laying that foundation. Who are you? What do you do? What do people think of you? And what do you want to have happen? And then steps 5 through 9 really are talking about the structure of your model. So how are you going to build your programs to deliver on that promise? And then step 10, this is where we talk about how do you design a data documentation and reporting system to support that. So the process, designing our model, implementing, re-implementing Apricot, and now administering and managing both model and Apricot have been and are time intensive. And it really was difficult to understand the full scope of the investment till we got into it. But we can say that we have found it to be incredibly worth the investment. And we continue to be committed to the belief that our program model, our intervention is worth studying, and the rigorous testing is really important. And the ability to do that kind of testing is now possible for us. So it's been very exciting. It's been rewarding. We have found that you kind of have to go all in when you're thinking about innovating program design. We also have found Apricot to be a very dynamic tool. It's evolved along with us, and the integration and the fluidity between the two, has made it possible for us to really begin to start answering some of these questions that we had way back when at the outset. So although this change has produced unknowns in our next steps, we're getting closer, and our culture is more engaged than ever in having these kinds of conversations. So it's been pretty cool.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Well, we appreciate everyone attending today's webinar and exploring this case study. So shortly, we're going to open up for questions. But before that, just a quick housekeeping item. You'll get a recording in the slides from today, probably later today. So please be on the lookout for that. And if you enjoyed today's presentation and our approach to Apricot software, we'd be open to finding some time to connect. Sarah and my doors are open, and we'd love to learn more about your organization, how you're running your programs, and your Apricot. So feel free to send us an email. So at this time, let's go ahead and open it up for questions. And I do see 2 questions in the panel. So if you do have other questions, feel free to put them in. So I will ask these of you, Sarah, or I can help too, I suppose. But one of them is, let's see, how does it read? Can you explain more how Apricot supports accreditation? So actually, that's an interesting question. I was thinking, you and I talked about this, how a data system can actually support accreditation and what we should put in Apricot versus what we shouldn't. But I'd be curious if you can just comment on Apricot and accreditation.
Sure. I think part of what we found when I can speak very specifically sort of about the PQI, the performance quality improvement part of the accreditation process, because what we found was when we started to read what was expected of us, we realized that because we had gone through this intense model and outcome design process, a lot of that had sort of been answered. We just had to organize it. And in fact, a lot of the work that we were doing with you, Jeff, to build the data quality reports, some of the kind of compliance reporting kinds of things were already built. We had to write it down. So it allowed us to just sort of sit and actually write the policy and the procedure that went along with what we had already designed. It also helps to focus and think about where in your processes are there sort of points of inflection where there could be quality challenges. So having the workflow right there in front of us and having it codified on the system allowed us to identify those inflection points sort of before we even started the accreditation process.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, the other thing I think we talked about was, going in, it's got to be easier, right? How can we save time? Case reviews take time, obviously, but how can we surface information and make the process proceduralized enough that we can actually reduce the amount of time we spend on those case reviews? And we're only a couple of cycles in, but we're starting to unpack how we can save more time. Um, so it's not a week
Absolutely.
or a month
Oh,
long
and
process. It's taking much, much less time is the goal.
oh yeah, I can randomly select those cases in no time, and it's just a matter of getting them done. The other thing I thought of was um, automating, the report run. So if I have to have a monthly report for an accreditation purpose, we can now set that up so that we can just have that run automatically.
So, Sarah, there's another question here. This one's probably good for you more on the cultural side. So, we're in the process of organizing our model. Who do you recommend being involved at the beginning?
So at the beginning, I mean, you definitely want, if you have somebody who serves in an operational role, like a director of operations, you definitely want your program directors and your executive leadership. And in some cases, these are going to be more in depth. So working with program directors to specifically identify what each program does and what they hope to achieve with those they serve. And then globally at the executive level, what you hope to achieve with all those you serve. And then some will just be sort of in support and information, just making sure you're checking in on a regular basis. At some point, you do kind of want to talk to as many people within the organization as possible. And for small organizations, of course, this is far more feasible. Larger organizations, we've actually helped kind of deploy a team, and they would go out and do that data gathering, or you can do surveys. So you just need kind of one person to lead the charge, and then you can engage other people to play different roles within that.
That's great. So there's one more question that came in here. Data topics have been a difficult conversation for our team. How or what did you do to get staff engaged?
I tried to answer their questions. So part of that process of talking to everybody about what you do every day and what you hope to see happen, and then you try to find the data sources to tell them, okay, what we're seeing is that this is happening every day, or that this is what's happening when people leave, so that you're engaging them from the data points that are of the most interest to them.
Mm-hmm.
So making sure that you have multi-level accessibility of data. And then, the thing that really got folks excited were those youth summary reports. They were answering very specific questions in real time that they needed as when they were sitting in the court or sitting in a team meeting with the state, that kind of thing. So just having your ear to the ground on what people need and trying to find the best way to get it to them.
I love this story, and maybe we close on this. I believe you played the Stump the Data Lady game and had,
Yes.
which I thought was amazing. I just thought it was really a great idea. Do you want to talk about what you did there and how you
Sure.
use that to kind of show staff members the full potential of Apricot? I think it's a good story.
Sure. Yeah, early on, before we even had computers for everybody, I used to go to the team meetings, and I would bring in different kinds of games on paper, and I would have prizes. So it's always fun food, games, and making it light and funny. But more recently, I will have Stump the Data Lady, and I'll go in, project Apricot on the screen, have staff throw out a various question or scenario, and say, where can I find that? And I will just find it for them. So I'm just modeling how to run a report to find the information that they're looking for. So that's been fun. And sometimes it creates an opportunity to create a new report or a new section of a report. And that's when I go back to Jeff and ask for help.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for joining us today. This has been fantastic, really insightful. Appreciate your time. And thank you everyone else
Sure.
for joining today. You'll get a recording in the slides later, and appreciate it. Everyone have a great day. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks. Bye.